Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. It is 9 a.m., time to start. I am John Marshall, which doesn't mean much to any of you, but I was the pastor of Second Baptist Church in Springfield, Missouri for 22 years. I retired from there 7 years ago and just finished my 8th interim. I fill in for churches while they're looking for pastors, and that's what I've done, and I enjoy doing that. When I retired 7 years ago, my wife and I knew that I needed something to make a transition into retirement. You do something. Well, I love history. I love the presidents. So I decided I would read a major biography of every president. So I did that. It took me 2 years for 20,000 pages. If there was a Pulitzer, I read the Pulitzer. There's a reason why they're Pulitzers. And so I read a biography of 45 of the presidents and just solidified my love for Mr. Lincoln and also Mr. Washington. Those are our two greatest, and they do stand apart even after all these years of research, and they still stand unto themselves. When I was the pastor at Second, 2, 3, 4 times a year, depending on how it hit me, I would talk about the Christian heritage of our nation. I would pick some topic, something. I did the biography of Washington over the years, and then I did Lincoln. I chose Lincoln, and Lincoln is a great mystery. Let me start off by saying to you, just let me tell you right up front, we do not have a clue as to what he believed at the end. If anybody tries to tell you that he was definitely this or definitely that, just sort of let it roll off of you, let it go. But his pilgrimage is so fascinating that I was enamored by it, and so I started my study of Lincoln, and and decided I was going to preach sermons based on his pilgrimage. And then after I got done with that, after 3 or 4 years of that, I finally wrote a book. And we do have copies of the book. My wife's out there. They're $5 a piece. Just try to cover cost, really. And then I have some other books out there, 3 for $10, whatever. Just help yourself. I'm just honored that you would take them and hope that you would enjoy them. So the question is, was Lincoln a Christian? We do not know. But his story is absolutely fascinating. He grew up a Baptist. He never missed church. He was a Baptist from his birthdays until he left and went to Springfield, Illinois. Was like a custodian in one. Never joined the church. He was turned off by 2 things in his Baptist rearing that caused him never to have anything to do with institutional church again, basically, except to attend occasionally his pastor friend there at the Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The extreme emotionalism. Both of his mothers, you remember, he had the one that died, and he had an adopted mother. Very emotional worshipers, just jumping, shouting, carrying on. And the preachers are the same way, jumping, shouting, running all over the place, sweating and walking on the back of your britches legs, that type of thing. And Lincoln, as a young man, loved to imitate Baptist preachers. And that was one of the things he'd do to get a good laugh. He'd jump up and preach and act like he was one of the Baptist preachers. He never was that emotional. He couldn't do that, and he rejected that entirely. He never joined a Baptist church, never joined any church, as you know. And but once you know that he was a Baptist, you can see a lot of his unusual beliefs that would come through from time to time. And so you understand him a little better when you understand he was a Baptist. That was his rearing. At least that was his training. That was his background. He rejected the emotionalism, but he rejected something else, which is even more important. And you need to stay with me now. Don't lose me now. If you lose me now, you're going to lose the purpose of this time that we're spending together. He was raised in what we would now consider, in the old days we used to call hard-shell Baptists. There are very few left of that. The old primitive Baptists, not many left. He was raised in Baptist churches that believed in what's called predestinarianism. That's not predestination. Predestination is the belief that God oversees whether or not you become a follower or not, whether you go to heaven or hell. Predestination is a discussion totally within the context of salvation. Are you going to go to heaven when you die or hell when you die? That's what the discussion of predestination is. That's still a very common discussion. That's I'm about in my fifth wave of controversy as a Southern Baptist over predestination. We go back and forth, back and forth. That's salvation only. Predestinarianism is the belief that God determines everything. You never have free will. You never do anything on your own. Not only do you not choose to have the choice to become a Christian, you don't even have the choice to decide who you're going to marry. You're just going to marry whoever God predetermined you were going to marry. All of life is predestinarian. Lincoln was stuck with that and could not get past it. He always envied the fact that his sister was one day walking through the woods and all of a sudden was overcome emotionally by the Spirit of God, and she fell on the ground and she called out to Jesus and got saved. He always envied that because she had an experience that she didn't choose, she didn't look for it, it happened. And therefore, she was a Christ follower. Well, that never happened to Lincoln. But Lincoln was left with this belief that you don't really choose. You don't really decide. God has to do all the deciding about everything in life. This stayed with him all the way to the Civil War, till the year 1862. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Okay, that's where we'll finish up, about 1862 in the Civil War. So in the meantime, Lincoln walked away from being a Baptist, became nothing, never joined a church of any kind, did fall in love with his Presbyterian pastor in Washington, D.C., the man who delivered the main address at his funeral. But basically, he walked away from faith, especially the institutional church. He was accused of being an atheist when he ran for president in 1860. First time he ran, not one preacher in Springfield, Illinois voted for him. Not one. That's how bad his reputation was with regard to spiritual things. In 1846, he was trying to get into Congress and trying to get into politics and other things. And he was always having to apologize or try to explain his beliefs. People would accuse him of being a skeptic and atheist at the time. That was pretty hard on you politically. And basically his answer was this. He would say, yes, I am not a member of a Christian church. That is true. But here's what he always stayed with. But I have never denied the truth of the Bible, and I have never spoken with any disrespect of any denomination. That basically was his position. I'm not a member of a Christian church, but Lincoln always loved the Bible, never could get away from it. It was the book of his childhood. He memorized whole chapters of the Bible, the King James Version, and he did not speak disrespectfully of any denominations. He struggled terribly spiritually trying to determine who he was. He felt the Bible character that was most like him was Doubting Thomas. He always related to the father whose son was suffering convulsions, and Jesus said everything is possible to the one who believes, and the father cries out, I believe, help my unbelief. He said that was him. The spiritual part of his life was always an agony to him. And so here he was, hung. He was not going to go back to the emotionalism of his Baptist roots. He wasn't going to go to an institutional church. He was stuck with this belief that God determines everything. And finally, as he got into the Civil War, he started coming back to the belief of his parents. Without the emotionalism and the predestinarianism, really struggled. That's where he was having trouble. As he started back to what you and I would consider just traditional Christian understanding of God and the world, there were some things he really had to struggle with. He struggled with hypocrisy among Christians. He struggled with Christians who claimed to be pro-slavery. Lincoln truly was radically anti-slavery, not just partly anti. I mean, he really was radically anti-slavery. He said the Bible says that you work by the sweat of your own brow. not by the sweat of another man's brow. I mean, he was totally sold out. So he had trouble with Christians, and so many Christians in America believed in slavery. He always struggled with man-made creeds in any denomination that would have a statement, a doctrine, of something they believed. He just couldn't handle that. To him, it was the Bible or nothing. The problem of suffering. See, he's trying to come back to what we understand as traditional understand Christianity. He struggled with the fairness of hell. That's one of the things he really struggled with. And then one of the things that really got him was self-righteous preachers. He felt that preachers claimed to know more than they really knew. And I guess you'd feel that way if every preacher in your hometown voted against you in the last election you were in. So he always struggled with that. But to his credit, for some reason, here's the mystery of Lincoln. He never quit exploring the spiritual realm. He always got upset at people who felt they had all the answers, but he himself, he was always on a search, never got stagnant. He was always developing. And so the question is, how far back did he come? Well, that's a good question. We'll finish up by looking at that. But here's what we know. Here's some of the things that helped him start coming back toward what we understand as Christianity. He fell in love with the churches of the North during the Civil War. He'd really been anti-church, anti-established church, but he saw during the Civil War he could not have won the war. He could not have fought the war were it not for the northern churches. He was upset to southern churches for their positions, but he came to understand that he could not have made it without the northern churches. In fact, in one of his letters, he said, talking to Methodists, he said, "God bless the Methodist Church." If I were a Methodist, I'd put that quote on every building in the United States of America. Lincoln, God bless the Methodist churches. I love that. That's him. He came to realize he could not have done, slavery could not have been ended were it not for the Christians. Then he moved back softer toward Christianity because every denomination in the North became strong supporters of Lincoln. In fact, he said in a letter, "I'm much indebted to the good Christian people of this country for their prayers." So he came back toward the churches. Then he grew in his understanding of Scripture and Christian principles. In his older years, he said he came to believe that the four Gospels came from the lips of Jesus. And he said, "I first heard them from my mother." And he said, "They are settled in my heart as the ultimate moral principles." He embraced temperance. You know, temperance is going to become a big deal. It's going to end up in prohibition 60 years later. He moved in that direction. This is a part of his deciding whether he wanted to be a traditional Christian or not. He kept coming back and coming back and coming back. He was always very humble. Now, he was an ambitious man, and when he lost his re-election bid for Congress, he said, "It's sad to live your life and not do anything to help the country that you live for." So he lost that, but as he came back home, he was always so humble. He was always so gracious to people. Later, you remember the story, one of the greatest stories of the presidents, of the 20,000 pages that I read. One of the most precious stories. If you've never read it, you need to read it. Was when the Union troops won Richmond, and Lincoln came into Richmond, and the African Americans saw him and realized who he was. That's one of the most precious and beautiful moments in American history, as those people would literally come and fall down before him, and Lincoln's going through Richmond trying to get through the streets and telling them, don't kneel to me. I only thank God. It's a precious moment. He never lost that humility. Then he didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He might take a drink occasionally, but he didn't. He did not use profane language. He did not gamble. He was crude in his humor. A lot of his humor has been polished by historians because he would tell jokes that were a little bit off color about the farm life and things like that, animals and things of that nature. But he had a way about him to where that he could disagree with someone and not turn them off. not drive them away. In other words, his position on alcohol was, he was a member of a temperance society, and he said he believed that we are not like them, talking of the alcoholics. He'd say we are not like them because we never had the appetite, not because we were morally superior. So you can just see him as he's embracing the faith of his father, so to speak. You can see him coming. You see this coming. As I said, he couldn't stand self-righteous preachers. And you know his famous quote about Ulysses S. Grant, when he picked Ulysses S. Grant to be the commander of the armies. And he said, if I knew what alcohol he drank, I'd buy one for every general in the Union Army. Well, that was written in a letter to a preacher. A preacher had written Lincoln a letter and said how upset he was that he would pick a man who was a heavy drinker. And Lincoln just couldn't take it. And he wrote back and gave him what for and said, if I knew what kind of liquor he drank, I'd give it to everybody. His humility just stayed with him all the way through. His favorite story about himself. You're going to love this. This was Lincoln's favorite story about himself. He said he heard a joke one day about himself. The two ladies were talking about the Civil War, and one said, I think Jefferson Davis will succeed because he is a praying man. The other lady said, well, Abraham Lincoln is a praying man too. And the first lady said, yes, but God will think Abraham Lincoln is joking in his prayers. So he always felt that was his favorite story about himself. Now, and I'm coming close to the end, and I hope you have some questions. If you have some questions, I'd love to answer them. I hope you'll ask me some questions, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. How far back did he come? Ida Tarbell, who wrote an excellent biography of Lincoln. I read Sandburg's Lincoln, 4,000 pages. That'll try you. I tell you, that'll test you. But as he's coming back, how far back did he come? One of the problems he really had was, since God predetermines everything, there's no need to pray. Now, you who are practicing Christians, try to imagine how close would you be to the Lord if you didn't have a prayer life? If you didn't feel that when you pray, God hears your prayer, answers your prayer, yes, no, or wait. All three of those, we believe God answers every prayer that we pray. Yes, no, or wait. And that is the heart and soul of who we are as believers, because we believe God is listening, responding. Yes, no, wait. So here's Lincoln trying to come back to the faith of his fathers, thinking he's moving back. And here's what began to happen. He never could pray because he felt the only purpose of prayer would just be, God, your will be done. So he did not have a prayer life. He did not feel that there was interaction between him and the Lord, because of this predestinarian, not predestination, predestinarian belief. But then, in 1862, the wall came crashing down. Lincoln would go down to the hospitals where the soldiers were. And we'd watch these men die and be screaming, the amputations and all. And it began to dawn on him, would God cause this? Can we say God would be the cause of this? See, if you believe in predestinarianism, you have no room in your theology for the fall of man, for the depravity of human beings. You have no place to put things like that other than to say God causes it. So Lincoln began to struggle with that. Then Lincoln also struggled with some personal tragedies. There were things in his own life that began to make him think, did God do this? His own mother died when he was 9 years old. He had to go find the preacher, had to help dig the grave, make the coffin. When he was 19, his sister Sally died, and he never did fully recover from that. That always broke his heart. At 26, Anne Rutledge died, and that's when there were people who thought he was going to commit suicide. His son Eddie died while he was still in Springfield, but the thing that finally caused the walls to come down, and Ida Tarbell is excellent with this, the thing that finally caused the walls to come crumbling in the Civil War, bearing the load of all these men dying and feeling he's to blame in a way, feeling like it's on his shoulders. He understands that he's caused this war, his election, and so he realizes that. But then looking around saying, I don't think God would do this. Then Willie died. And when Willie died, for the first time, as Ida Tarbell excellently points out, for the first time, Abraham Lincoln had to look outside himself for help. He was always self-sufficient, always. He always felt he could face anything, do anything. He could overcome anything. But when he took the Civil War and you took the death of Willie, that's when he began to rethink again. Maybe God is not responsible for all these things. Maybe we do have human choice. Maybe I can decide to become a Christ follower. Maybe I don't have to have an experience like my sister had, being knocked down in the woods, and God overwhelmed me, and I become a Christ follower. And so it's from 1862 until he died that we begin to wonder, how far is he coming? What's going on here? He's now going to the Presbyterian Church. You can still go there today, see the pew where he sat. On Wednesday night, the pastor there would teach pretty in-depth about Scripture. Lincoln would go sneak in and sit in the pastor's study, and they would open the doors where he could hear. So things are going on in his life. In those days, Presbyterians were more evangelistic than you would think of them today, thinking more about the personal relationship with the Lord, being born again, as we Baptists would say it. And so he would sit there and he's listening, and you're wondering, how far is he coming? How far is he going to come back toward the faith of his fathers? Well, we'll never know. He never talked about it with his pastors, the Presbyterian pastor there in Washington, even though he loved him. He just somehow knew that he needed to move back in that direction. It is significant to me. Let's say it's ironic. It is ironic that at Ford's Theater, the night that he died, he was talking with Mary Todd about the things of the Lord. It's very interesting. In his final conversation with Mary Todd, and he had said he wanted to go to the Holy Land. Said when he was no longer president, he would like to go to the Holy Land. And his last sentence was, according to Mary Todd, there's no city on earth I so much desire to see as Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the last word he ever said. Very interesting that a man who was torn by the agony of war, his last word was a word that means city of peace, Jerusalem. And so how far back he came, we do not know. Your guess is as good as mine. But he was coming. We just don't know how far he got. Well, okay, that's enough about Lincoln. Do you have a question that you'd like for us to... yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know how he was as a husband.
First of all, okay, she asked, how was Lincoln as a husband? First of all, let me say that Mary Todd was mentally... I'm not going to use the word insane. She was finally put away for insanity by Robert Todd. She never was normal, as you and I would see normal. So Abraham Lincoln had trouble relating to her just as a person because of her mental illness. So the question, how was he as a husband? He certainly tried to be good to Mary Todd. She was one of those people it was almost impossible to be kind to. She would throw... He would be out in the carriage, the president's carriage with Mary Todd, and sometimes a lady would just wave or say something nice to him, and she'd scream at him. She'd scream at the lady. She had... There are books written about Mary Todd. It's a fascinating study, and they did finally put her away. Now, where he really failed was as a father. He had no form of discipline. His boys were as wild and crazy as they could be because he overreacted to the way he was raised by his own father. There's a great... the study of Abraham Lincoln's relationship with his father is one of the great tragedies of the presidential studying I did. He could not stand his father, did not go to his funeral, had no dealings with the burial and those kinds of things. His father was extremely harsh. Abraham wanted to read. His daddy didn't want him to know how to read. He fought everything that Abraham ever did to try to achieve or succeed. His father fought it. So he and his father, it's a terrible tragedy. He had no use for his dad. Dad had no use for him. But on the other hand, he had two wonderful mothers. Historians now can tell you, this is a fascinating study. Historians can tell you by conversation of Abraham Lincoln which mother he's talking about. When he talked about his mother, they've now discerned, when he's talking about his first mother, he would use this term. Talking about the second mother, he used this term. That's a fascinating study. And also, one of the most interesting things that I read in the life of Lincoln that could never happen today, never, when he got elected president. He's waiting to go to Washington, D.C., but he wanted to go see his mother. And so he's the president-elect of the United States of America, getting ready to lead us into the worst war we ever fought. One night, he goes down to the railroad station by himself, nobody with him, no police, no Secret Service officer, nothing. Jumps on a cargo train, rides to the little town where his mother is, jumps off the train, goes, sees his mother, and she says she believed they would kill him. She said, that's an interesting part of that story. And he'd say, no, Mama, we gotta trust that the Lord will take care of us. And when they later did tell her that he'd been assassinated, she said, I know they'd kill him. That was her response. He went and visited his mother, went back down to the train depot, got on and went back home. That would never happen now. An elected president of the United States. So he had this great relationship with his mothers. The father, it was terrible. And with Mary Todd, I'm not trying to excuse Lincoln. I'm just saying it was almost impossible. Her situation was such very difficult. And with his boys, he overreacted to the way he was raised by his father. All right, what else? Yes, sir.
I was going to mention, I think in going directly off of what you said, first of all, I want to say I'm a historian by trade at the university for many years, and I really appreciate the way you approach it.
Thank you.
So many people who are Christians today try to force that
Right.
on Lincoln. No, I love Lincoln. I just have to know that he was an evangelical,
Right.
born-again Christian.
That's what they want him to be.
And so I think your presentation is brilliant in that aspect. One of the things that has always struck me is his second inaugural address.
Yes, the most famous sermon in American history. That's one of the chapters in my book, America's Most Famous Sermon, and it's the second inaugural.
And when he gets to that point, and it plays so nicely to what you pointed out, I think, is that he gets, he's setting it up, and he's overwhelmed by the death of his son and the casualties that have accumulated under his leadership. But it's like he just almost explodes at the notion that we've got half the country claiming
Exactly.
God is on our side and half the country. But you can almost see the anger in his voice.
Yes.
Let's get this straight. We brought this war on, and everybody knows that somehow slavery is the cause of it. So it wasn't predestinary in a sense that he was manipulating anything, but it was like collectively saying, we made some very,
Yep.
very bad choices, and God, he didn't lay it out, this is why God did it A, B, C, but he gets to that point in the address where
Yeah.
God has his own purposes.
And right out there's a great book that has a chapter about that in it. But anyway, that was a joke. But anyway, right out there. Okay, that's what my jokes usually are. Your point is well made. Everybody wants a piece of Lincoln. The Episcopalians are glad he got married in one of their churches. Presbyterians rejoice that was his choice in the later years. The Baptists, of course, we're thrilled that we raised him, that type of thing. The Cumberland Presbyterians, they love the fact that his views on alcohol were determined in his young years by a Cumberland Presbyterian pastor who wrote a treatise that he read, and it affected him the rest of his life. The Church of Christ, some of you may be Church of Christ, believing that salvation is dependent on baptism. In the churches of Christ, There is a story, a legend, a story told that he had a friend who was Church of Christ, and one night they came back. They went out somewhere, they came back, and his clothes were wet. And he'd taken an extra pair of clothes. So, and they say that he probably was baptized by that Church of Christ minister. So everybody wants a piece of Lincoln. It really is amazing. Everybody, that's how respected Lincoln is. And you're hard pressed to, in my 20,000 pages of reading the presidents, you can find lots of things wrong with lots of guys. But with Lincoln, it's a little bit harder to really find a secret spot where he had a true, dark, deep secret. Yes, ma'am.
I had heard that the Civil War was mostly about states' rights, but then later he knew he wouldn't win unless he pressed and emphasized the slavery part, and then that won the war. And then the second question is, when they were courting, did they either one of them have misgivings about being married to each other?
First of all, yes, the Civil War was about states' rights, the states' rights to hold slaves. So yes, states' rights was the issue. But slavery, the war was about slavery, always was. Do you remember at the Battle of Gettysburg, the charge by the brigade from Maine that saved Little Round Top? Chamberlain went on to become the governor of Maine. When his men almost mutinied, not long before the Battle of Gettysburg, he said to them, "We are the first army in the history of the world to fight for the freedom of others, not ourselves." It's very interesting. Slavery was the issue. That was the point. The South, the wealth of the South, was much more in the slaves than the people who worked the land. The slaves were the wealth. I mean, thousands of dollars in the 1840s and 50s and 60s per slave. Slavery was the issue. Now, with regard to regretting, Lincoln probably started out in his relationship with Mary Todd thinking he had no choice, predestinarian. You know, it was just God's will for him. And Lincoln always had this amazing ability just to yield until finally the Willie died. And then finally, as Tarbell brings out, he finally broke. He had to look outside himself. But so my guess would be if you walked up to Lincoln and said, "Did you think he made a mistake?" He probably would have said no. Now Mary Todd, it said she wanted to marry a future president. She picked well. She got the right one. She was very wealthy, came from a wealthy family in the South. So my gut level answer would be, no, they never regretted it, but I don't know what they thought in the middle of the night when they were alone. But that's my feeling.
You never mentioned migraines. Wasn't that something she experienced?
Oh, she experienced everything. There's nothing you can say or talk about that she did not experience. And when Robert Todd read a book about Mary Todd, when Robert Todd had to make the decision to put her away, he truly had no choice. She squandered everything she touched. Everything was lost. He was trying to protect the reputation of his father. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Grant was the hero of the 19th century. Lincoln did not begin to come into real prominence till about 1905, 1910. They built the Lincoln Memorial about 1920, something like that. And Robert Todd, still alive, was there for that occasion. In the late from 1865 on, once Lincoln died, America went through a terrible time of mourning. It was the first national news item in the history of the United States. Since I'm a preacher, I'll tell you this story. Before the war started, Lincoln felt the most important man in America was Henry Ward Beecher, the great preacher. There's just been a new book written on Beecher. It's excellent. And the title of it, Most Important Man in America, was Lincoln's quote about the preacher Henry Ward Beecher. It was Henry Ward Beecher that invited Lincoln to come to New York before he was elected president and give what's now called the Cooper Address, where he so perfectly articulated his views on slavery. That that lecture was supposed to be given in the church where Henry Ward Beecher was pastor. But they knew they wouldn't have enough room, so they went to the Cooper Theater. That's why it's called the Cooper Sermon. All right. Henry Ward Beecher is the preacher who would buy slaves, put them on the platform in a worship service, and sell them to his people and give them their freedom. You think that didn't stir up the South? And it was his sister that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so this family is pretty important. And Lincoln said that Beecher was the most important man in America. Well, so when Fort Sumter was taken back again, and Lincoln, they wanted Lincoln to come and dedicate, when they put the flag up, he said, no, I don't deserve this honor. It needs to go to Henry Ward Beecher. So he sent the preacher. And they were having that ceremony when they got the word that Lincoln had been assassinated. But Lincoln, he felt that he had choices and he had decisions to make. The Mary Todd story, though, is a tough one. You can read books about it. But anyway, so Lincoln dies. There's this grieving time, but somehow Grant gets the credit for being kind to the Southern soldiers, even though Grant was actually obeying orders from Lincoln. Somehow Grant comes out smiling like a rose. We have the 4 years of Andrew Johnson, maybe our worst president. The worst decision Lincoln ever made was Andrew Johnson. It was terrible. Andrew Johnson almost undid in 4 years what we lost 700,000 lives over in the Civil War. Grant couldn't take it. So Grant becomes elected. He travels the world. He then becomes president of the United States. He's beloved, most honest man who ever lived. Everybody around him was a bunch of thieves and liars and crooks and everything. So Grant is the one who, in the late 1800s, becomes the great hero in America. He is the man. All right. So here's Mary Todd doing the crazy thing she does. Robert Todd, caught in this dilemma of watching his daddy actually be in the shadow of Grant, but also at the same time knowing he needs to protect his dad's reputation. So he would try to keep his mother from doing embarrassing things. And so you see this, he's trying to protect his dad. She's squandering everything she has. She cannot live a controlled life. Her temper is totally uncontrolled. And he finally puts her away. And boy, that stirred the pot. When he put her in the insane asylum, that stirred the pot. So that's the fascinating corollary to the story of Abraham Lincoln.
But didn't she get out and move to France?
I do not know what happened to her, Tina. I don't remember.
She had a lot of wealthy friends, and she wrote, the biographies that I read about her, that she had a lot of wealthy friends, and a lot of them did not believe what brought her to
Exactly.
Yeah, she did do some of the stuff, but her husband, can't blame her too much, but she was in there for a couple years, and then she eventually moved to Paris, France.
That's right. I'd forgotten that. That is correct. She went to Europe, which took her off the main stage here. Right.
I have a quick question about the seances that Mary
Yes.
would come in the White House to speak to Willie and Eddie, and just when
Yes.
and I know he kind of tolerated, but
Yes.
he never participated in it.
He never participated, but from his earliest years, Lincoln would not speak against a religious group. He couldn't do it. The study of seances is a remarkable study in American history. They become prolific after war. You had it after the Civil War, you had it after the First World War, you had it after the Second World War, not so much after Vietnam and Korea, but people want to talk to the dead. And you always have charlatans who are certainly willing to take your money, who will do the research to find out what your children might have said, even, all those kinds of things. But yes, Mary Todd did have seances in the White House, and yes, Abraham Lincoln did come to, I think, 3 or 4. But he never claimed to believe. In fact, one of his secretaries, his 2 secretaries, one of them, he told no, he did not believe. But as historians, when you have one person saying something and one person saying another, this is the dilemma of historians. And so, did Lincoln believe it or not? Well, we don't think so, but we can't say for sure. Thanks for bringing that up. The seances were important. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier about 5 things that Lincoln didn't care for. One of them was the preacher.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the fairness of hell.
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
All right. Yes, I can. Because he was, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. He's asking about, would I expand on why Lincoln had trouble with believing in hell. Lincoln had trouble believing in hell because he was predestinarian. Remember, he cannot escape that. Therefore, whereas in traditional Christianity, who would consider ourselves in the main Orthodox position, we believe a person goes to hell because they themselves make a decision that causes them to go there. Whereas if you're predestinarian and God's determining everything, a person has no choice whether to go to heaven or hell. They're doomed from the first moment. And so that was his problem with hell, was the feeling that why would God create individuals that their sole purpose is going to be they're going to end up in hell. So that's where the problem with hell comes from. And so once again, that's not one of those questions, well, how far back does he come? We don't know. A lot of that's just lost in there. Yes, ma'am.
So how far into his marriage did Mary Todd start acting?
Immediately. She was mentally ill before he married her. He tried to break up with her once and went through a terrible time of depression. And some believe that the depression, of course, now Lincoln battled depression his whole life. I battled I battled depression until I was 35. I'm 73 now, so I've had 38 years since then. But I still have to be very careful. And those of you who struggle with real depression, I'm not talking about you having a blue day. I mean, those of you, we understand. There are some who think that Lincoln, when he broke up with Mary Todd, was thrown so much into a fit of depression, so deep, that he married her to get out of the depression. For those of you who have ever really struggled with true depression, that's a reality. I mean, you can do that. Sometimes a person who's really struggling with depression will do things that it's not a logical thing. It's not something you would think through and process. You just somehow think that'll help your depression. And there are many who think that. But she was a basket case early on.
I wondered if there's a genetic component within her side of the family having mental problems.
Probably so. I personally believe that there is a genetic predisposition to most mental illness. That's, yes, circumstances can make it worse, and the mishandling of things can make it worse. For instance, when I was struggling with depression, I'm a pastor and I'm preaching about living a victorious life. Finally, 38 years ago, a man came into my life who had battled depression and began to help me to see. I'll just give you a good example. I thought depression was sadness. He helped me understand depression usually is anger, suppressed, but you can't stay angry all the time. You'll die. Your heart will just quit. So the body somehow changes anger into sadness. So by the time it gets to you, and when my wife was my coach, she led me. The Lord used her to lead me out of depression. We read The Happiness is a Choice book by Minirth and Meyer, which has now sold over 1 million copies. She read it and I read it, and we walked through it. And so as my wife helped guide me out of that season of depression, she would start asking me, quote, what was making me mad as opposed to sad. And she would ask questions like, for instance, I might be 2 days behind in my sermon preparation for Sunday. And I'm angry that I was too busy. I was angry I got asked to do this. And she would ask the question. She'd say, "How you doing on sermon preparation?" And she could tell by the way I would answer, that's it right there. So she was the one. So you have to learn about. So I think there's always a part of mental illness that is something that we inherit, something that's a part of our nature. And then I think a lot of us we don't understand. And what in the world could the Lincolns have understood about mental illness? What in the world could have Mary Todd's family have known? They wouldn't have known anything. It's tough. You're facing a tough road to hoe. Yes, ma'am.
They didn't have medication.
They had nothing. They had nothing. You're on your own. Yes, ma'am.
What was Mary Todd's beliefs?
Mary Todd basically was an Episcopalian, essentially. That was her. That's why they got married in an Episcopalian church. She stayed pretty much to it all through the years. Yeah. That's a great. You ever want to read an exciting biography? Read something about Mary Todd, and also read the books. There have been books written about Abraham Lincoln's relationship to his father. That'll wake you up too. Okay, thank you all for letting me do this. Enjoyed this. That was a lot of fun. I don't know. Do I turn this over to somebody or are we done? Keep talking. All right. Yeah. But what? Don't ever tell the pastor that. That's good.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Is this the young man that loves presidents that I was told about?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And show him your socks you got on today. He's got these Lincoln
We'll
socks.
take your,
'cause he's
we'll
got-
take
Oh.
your,
Okay, I have to have a picture of this. Now, come over. We've got to have a picture of this. That is.
I got my
great.
Lincoln tie on and my Lincoln socks.
I'm gonna take your mic
All right, hold
real
on.
quick so
Keep
we
your
can
pants
mute
on.
it. I forgot to mute it back there.
That's
but I'm gonna
okay.
mute it here.
Okay. Thank you. You did a great job. There you go. Thank you.